Je pense sans cesse à toi.
Hello and welcome to The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. We will be munching on three very dense courses in episode 16. First, how might the Trump administration change the restaurant industry? Second, stuck in the middle. We hear a lot about big ag and then small boutique farms, but what's going on in the world of mid-sized agriculture? And finally, institutional eating. If there's one thing all Americans can agree on, it's the fact that the food in our hospitals, jails, and schools is universally awful. Today I'm in the studios of OPB, joined by Amanda Oborne, Vice President of Food and Farms at EcoTrust. Welcome, Amanda.
Thanks, Catherine.
And Greg Astley, Director of Governmental Affairs at the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association. Thank you for joining us, Greg.
You're welcome.
And Virginia Gewin, a journalist covering food security and crop diversity for publications such as Science, Nature, and Modern Farmer. Hey, Virginia.
Hi, Catherine.
Our first course today will be political. I have heard from restaurant owners that while they're publicly maybe not fans of the Trump administration, they're struggling financially and they're privately hoping that a president who is in the hospitality industry will bring them some relief from the pressures they are facing. Greg Astley, you've worked in regional and national politics for many years, and I'm curious what you're hearing. Do you expect the current national political climate to have an effect on the bottom lines of restaurant owners?
Well, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I think it depends on the day, right? With this administration, you never know what we're going to see from day to day. We had a Secretary of Labor, Andrew Puzder, that was a fast food CEO and could have brought a different spin to things. And now we have Andrew Acosta. I think that on the one hand, businesses, especially restaurants who operate on a small profit margin, have been hit pretty hard lately with a lot of regulations, increased minimum wages and the overtime pay increases. They've gotten a lot of challenges thrown their way. And now you've got somebody in the White House who's a hotelier and who understands the restaurant industry. And so there could be some loosening of some of the OSHA regulations and penalties. But on the other side of the coin, there's going to be some challenges, especially around immigration. President Trump has already signaled that that's going to be one of the keys of his administration, and that obviously impacts the restaurant industry greatly. We have a lot of immigrants that work in the restaurants all across the country.
And can you back up a little bit, Greg, and tell us about the OSHA regulations that might be loosened? And what does OSHA stand for? Remind us.
Sure. Sorry. The Office of Safety and Health Administration, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So some of the rules under President Obama, the penalties were increased for employers. And I think what we're going to see with the Trump administration is a loosening of some of those penalties, which means that employers won't be nickeled and dimed on a lot of the penalties now that there would have been under the Obama administration. The overtime pay certainly is a big one, and the question there is whether or not any businesses have already implemented their overtime changes. There was a judge in Texas that blocked that from going forward back in December, the increase from roughly $24,000 to almost $48,000 for overtime pay. And after that was blocked, a lot of businesses had already actually implemented that change because there was an early December deadline to do that. So whether or not that overtime pay threshold comes down from $48,000 or not, a lot of businesses have already given their employees, their salaried employees, a big bump in salary to make sure that they cover those.
Oh, boy. So they can't really go back from that.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to take money away from somebody once you've given them a raise. So a lot of them are just dealing with the fact that that's happened. And it's just another issue that businesses are having to deal with as they move forward. So.
You know, Virginia, I want to throw this to you because I think so many of us in food journalism, there are so many stories about wonderful restaurants that serve organic food and this kind of precious industry, but we don't hear about how hard it is to run a restaurant business, do we?
No, not very often. And I, I don't even pretend to know like all the dynamics that are at play. I think that, one of the things that comes instantly to my mind when Puzder was kicked out was, well, there goes the minimum wage issue. We don't have to really worry about that. But I don't know if that's the case, Greg. Is it something that, that even Acosta is going to look at that as well?
Acosta hasn't really been as vocal as Puzder was about the minimum wage, and so we don't really know. And I think that's kind of a key word whenever we talk about the Trump administration is that uncertainty. Or that unpredictability. We literally don't know from day to day or week to week what's going to be coming next. And so that's really one of those negatives for business as well. I mean, no business likes to run on uncertainty, and having to deal with those kinds of things on a regular basis means that it's difficult to plan. It's difficult to work through some of those issues.
And there's also the question of what's on a national level and what's on a regional level, what's on a state level, what's on a city level. There are issues like predictive scheduling that I know restaurant owners and their employees grapple with. And that's the issue of kind of like scheduling someone to work at the very last minute or for an odd number of hours that they weren't planning for. And it can be inconvenient, but it's tough for a restaurant owner to foresee these needs that they have. Yeah,
well, for example, here in Portland recently, we've had to deal with the weather. I know January was one of the worst months for our restaurant owners because of the snow and the ice and the fact that employees couldn't get into work, or that employers called them and told them not to come into work because it wasn't safe. And on top of that, the Trump protests that we've had on an ongoing basis, almost daily, I would say, but I think they've gotten down to about a weekly basis. But, the last big round of protests that we had here, there were a lot of businesses that had to board up their windows. They were afraid that windows were going to get broken out. And so as an employer, you don't want to subject your employees to coming down and having to deal with some of those issues. And so you may call them off or have them stay at home. The current bills in the legislature around predictive or restrictive scheduling don't address weather or sporting events. The Ducks are in the NCAA tournament, both the men and the women. And right now the men are in the Sweet 16. I think the women beat Duke the other night too. So as a sports bar, you may go ahead and staff up for the full NCAA tournament thinking that the Ducks are going to go a long way. And if they lose in the first round, you've suddenly got 2 weeks of scheduled staff that you don't need because your bar is not going to be quite as full. So there are a lot of challenges around that. On the federal level, one of the issues we're seeing that's big, and we're hoping that the Supreme Court will pick up the case, is the tip pooling, which we've been able to do in Oregon because we are what's called a non-tip credit or non-tip waged state. We're one of only 7 in the country. And so when you hear about minimum wages in other places, in Texas or Arizona or someplace, it may only be $2.75 or $3.50 an hour for your minimum wage as a tipped employee. And then you earn your tips on top of that. In Oregon, that's not the case. And we have a court case right now, actually, that's pending. We're hoping that the Supreme Court will pick it up because the Department of Labor changed the rule in the middle of a lawsuit and said that in previous years, if you were a non-tip credit state like Oregon, then your servers would have to tip out the back of the house, the cooks and the dishwashers and those kinds of folks, and that you could require that as an employer. And in the middle of this lawsuit during some of the appeals, the Department of Labor changed that rule and said that, nope, all those tips belong to the server. And at that point, you could not force anyone to tip out to the back of the house. And that's caused a real inequity, a real inequality in the wages that the front of the house and the back of the house have. You've got 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the back of the house was making a lot more money than the front of the house. And now you've got servers who are working 20, 30 hours a week, making 3 or 4 times as much as what the folks in the back of the house are making.
Isn't that creating, this is Amanda, isn't that creating a pretty serious shortage of line cooks?
It's very difficult to find line cooks and folks for the back of the house. It's also creating a change institutionally among the restaurant industry. We're seeing a lot more folks move away from full service because they don't want to have to deal with the tipping and moving to a counter service model. You're seeing automation, not generally in Oregon, but in some other states. I think you're going to start to see a lot more automation. McDonald's, for example, is just now starting to offer kiosks where you can go up and order off of a giant iPad, for lack of a better term. You send your order in, you walk up, and you just pick up the food, and that's it. You don't have to deal with somebody at the front taking your order and then putting it all in. You're doing it yourself. And how many of us have apps on our phone nowadays where you can order a pizza or a sandwich or just about anything? So we're seeing a lot more of that. It's changing the way the restaurant industry is looking for sure.
Speaking of McDonald's, I think one thing that everyone in the food industry sort of noted right away with this new president is that he is a fan of fast food. And it is such a stark contrast to, Michelle Obama with her organic garden. And now we've got this president who is just a strong proponent of fast food. I'm curious, Amanda, what do you think about that?
Well, there are all kinds of things to think about the example that sets. But I, in my mind, it just reinforces what is so obvious with this president, that agriculture is just really not on his radar. It's not at the top of the priority list, which is having some really fascinating, I think, unintended consequences. The things that he does care about, trade, immigration, labor, all have enormous implications for agriculture and all the way through to the type of food we end up eating, be it fast food or otherwise. But he's not thinking about the implications on agriculture specifically. He's thinking about his social agenda. And so it's a fascinating to watch from the sidelines about how that's going to roll out on people, in many cases who voted for him and really thought that he would be an advocate for them and are finding that maybe they're on different sides of some of those issues.
A lot of those issues.
Yeah. I think we're going to come back and talk about undocumented labor more in a future show, but it is worth noting quickly, we've mentioned it a couple times in this conversation, that so many restaurant kitchens are relying on this labor, not to mention the farm industry, as you mentioned, Amanda.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that maybe Americans are only now really coming to understand as all of this hubbub is hitting the airwaves about immigration policy and even trade policy and labor policy, certainly, that so much, our food industry doesn't work without our immigrant labor force. And if we got into some sort of a trade war with the countries where we source many of our fruits and vegetables and other food, particularly when it's out of season here, I think Americans would just be shocked at what's available, what's on offer in their grocery store or at their favorite restaurant.
Yeah, the next time you're shopping, check where those strawberries are coming from, because it may not be from California this time of year. So.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I find so fascinating about Trump and the knock-on impacts, especially with restaurants, is clearly there are some issues with running a business, and that Trump's policies may in effect help a lot of restaurateurs get through the economic times that they're facing. But on the flip side, you're seeing the rise of sanctuary restaurants, which I think is kind of fascinating. That wouldn't have happened without Trump in office. And, you already have 300 plus restaurants that are signed on to this pledge that, there's no gender issues, there's no immigration, we just see people. And I think that statement is really profound and shows the impact that the restaurant industry can have in other ways, and is something that I've kind of been keeping my eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting development. And like you said, under previous administrations, I don't think we would have ever seen anything like that. So once again, unpredictable, uncertain is kind of the key word here.
Yeah, like you were saying before, Greg, the protests against Trump have changed the restaurant industry as well. It's also fascinating, and I'm sure we'll be revisiting this subject over and over. I think we should move on and get back to the subject of farms. Our second topic today is stuck in the middle. You would think that there were only two types of farms in the U.S. First, those tiny, precious local operations that grow produce for white tablecloth restaurants and farmers markets. And then we also hear a lot about big ag offering massive quantities of food for an attractive price. But what about mid-sized regional farms? I feel like we just never hear about them. Virginia Gewin, you have been on the agriculture beat for a long time, and I'm curious to hear your take on the types of farms that supply national brands and larger restaurant chains, but aren't on the big ag scale. What's the current status of mid-sized farms?
Well, the middle option, typically known as the Goldilocks option, is usually considered a safe bet, but not so when it comes to farms. We don't hear about mid-sized farms because they are disappearing. The latest numbers, if I can do my Kai Ryssdal impression, mid-sized farms account for about 21% of the total production, but they are about 6% of U.S. farms as of 2014. Large farms are about 60% of production and only about 4% of the farms. The rest, about 90% of farms are small farms, are small, local, precious tinies, and they produce about the same amount as mid-sized farms. So the scary number, actually, though, is that mid-sized farms have declined by about 5% since 1992. That's a loss of about 6,000 farms. And that those farms, the mid-sized farms typically make anywhere between $350,000 to $1 million a year. And they are also just kind of the rockiest. About a third of those mid-sized farms have seen their income increase or decrease by more than 50% in the last decade and a half. So they're either growing or they're falling apart.
Well, I wonder what some reasons are to explain this problem. Amanda, might this have something to do with federal crop subsidies? Are they going to the wrong place? Or
that's a part of the story, but I think a larger part of the story is probably just the enormous industry consolidation that's happened in agriculture over the last 30 years. You know, way back Earl Butz, as we all remember, saying, we've heard it over and over again that he said, get big or get out. And they did. Mm-hmm. They got big. And that consolidation left those mid-scale sort of family-sized, regionally focused farms to go bankrupt or to sell or to, in one way or another, get out of that middle space. And it's interesting because the work I do at EcoTrust in trying to develop really strong, really robust regional-scale food economies, I think helping redevelop that ag of the middle, quote-unquote ag of the middle sector, is one of the most important things we can be doing. It's 1/3 of the work that my team spends their time on is trying to identify those producers that have aspirations to grow and are sort of poised to develop to that scale, or working with larger scale production entities that are keen to carve off a portion of their production to orient it toward a regional market. Or lastly, to knit a bunch of these smaller scale producers together and have them show up in the market larger than they might otherwise be on their own. So Organic Valley and Stallbush Island Farms and Shepherd's Grain are all great examples of co-op type models where smaller independent farmers are making a big impact in their markets.
But you think about it, and I mean, because I think EcoTrust even did a report within the last couple of years that you were part of. That was,
You've been reading my homework.
I read your homework. Just looking even at Burgerville. So our local chain that prides itself on regional flavors and doing as much as it can. I mean, I think according to that report, only 72% of their supply chain could come from local and regional sources.
Right, 72% is an enormous number.
I know, and that's huge. And that's the guy that's trying desperately to do this.
Right.
What about all of those other fast food restaurants or, bigger restaurants that want to do this? It just seems like, if that's the high bar that they're hitting and really striving to hit, what does it look like for everybody else?
Yeah, I think there's a notion of regional resilience that's applicable and relevant here, that you wouldn't want the locavore model of eat everything from within 100 miles, I think, doesn't make a lot of sense as you scale that up. It's fun as a way of introducing people to the notion of where your food comes from. It's a great little sort of a promotional tool. But the reality is, especially at a larger scale, if you were sourcing 100% of what you were eating as a community from within that community and you had some massive crop failure or some catastrophic event, that leaves you really, really vulnerable. So in addition to the fact that we all want avocados or olive oil or lemons or things that don't grow in our home region, there is also this notion that there's an appropriate blend, a sort of both and kind of answer to the question of local, regional versus large and commodity or global industrial, that I personally think the sweet spot is probably somewhere between at the low end 30-ish%, at the high end closer to 50% of the food of a larger scale buyer coming from a local region. Now, Burgerville is at 72%. I think that includes products that are processed in this region, even if they aren't grown in this region. But so the 30 to 50% sort of range feels like a pretty awesome one. If our institutions, if our larger scale restaurant chains were sourcing at that level from within the region, it would completely change our economy here.
Well, and I think one of the challenges, obviously, from the restaurant side is if you are Burgerville, you serve a certain amount of the same foods all the time, right? You've got your Walla Walla sweet potatoes or the hazelnut milkshakes coming in, but you've got other stuff that you have to have year in, year out. And so if you're doing something like your halibut fish sandwich, you have to make sure that you can get enough of that halibut to supply your customers with it. When it's a smaller restaurant, it's a lot easier because you can change your menu a little more often. You can be a little more flexible with that. But when people go to a chain, they kind of expect to see the same foods if they're in Albany or if they're in Tigard. So you've got to make sure that you've got enough of a supply, a big enough farm or supplier, whoever it may be, to be able to supply that product for you.
I've been thinking about distribution channels as I've been listening to you and thinking about the microbrew industry and the idea that, you've got your big brewers, you've got your Budweisers and your Millers, and they've got trains and trucks and they've got a national distribution network. And what they've done, for better or for worse, is buy up or merge with some of these smaller microbrewers. And then those smaller microbrewers get a little space on that truck. And I wonder, Amanda or Virginia, have you seen any of the large ag companies partnering with some of these smaller and mid-sized farms and saying, "Hey, we've got an extra shipping container. Throw your stuff on there." That seems like it would be a great solution.
I haven't seen that level of generosity in that form, I have to say. But I do think that a model like Organic Valley's model is a really brilliant one, where the milk that we get here in the Pacific Northwest that's marketed as Organic Valley is coming from dairies in the Pacific Northwest. So they've worked out all the very complicated logistics of having the product that's distributed in a region also be grown or raised or produced in that region. And they do that for regions all over the country. So I think that's kind of an incredible model, maybe a little bit analogous to what you're saying, where a large entity sort of uses their scale to raise the tide for all the boats sort of idea.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like there are also companies like Pacific Foods based here in Oregon, but I think they're maybe at least Western.
National.
Oh, they're national. Has their own organic farm. And so they're supporting farmers by actually just packaging up their own organic produce.
Well, what's interesting when I was looking online a couple of days ago, and there's a survey from OSU's Extension Office, and they had asked local farmers, what is your biggest barrier to expanding your current products? And these were, I think only 30% of them were organic, solely organic, but they were all cropland. This wasn't dairy. This wasn't, livestock. And they overwhelmingly said labor. And you think about Mr. Unpredictable, and you think about labor, and you think about, nobody else is going to do those jobs. It just seems like if that's your biggest barrier, we are in for some really rocky times, especially for that middle-sized farm that's really in a very precarious place to begin with, and then you take labor away, and it's going to be an interesting, even rockier few years. So
yeah, I'm sure as a farmer there's a balance point between how much it costs to invest in a new piece of automated equipment, whether it's a thresher or a picker or whatever it might be, versus having it hand-picked. And if you're not big enough to buy it and make it work out, can you lease it or do you rely on human hands? And if you do and that's going away, what are you going to do in the future for that?
Well, what's scary really quickly is that a lot of farmers, especially in areas where like California and North Carolina, older farmers, all of these guys, a lot of them are aging older. They can't take the risk anymore. And more, they are letting their land go to solar farms. And so there was a great piece in Civil Eats about this just a few weeks ago, highlighting that to take the risk out of the equation, solar is good money right now. And so you have all this farmland that could go to something that is no longer producing the food that it once did.
Or marijuana if you're in Oregon.
It's true.
Right?
That's true.
So we'll just be eating power and pot. There won't be any food left.
Doesn't that sound delicious?
Oh, my goodness. Greg, I'm curious. You probably talk to a lot of people who work with national hotel chains, large hotel chains. Did they express a desire to get more regional farms in there? I mean,
I think it comes down to the business of can they supply that food? I mean, again, if you're a large hotel chain and you've got a banquet coming in of 650 people, if you're looking for free-range chicken or if you're looking for organic quinoa, can you find it? And in enough supply to be able to offer it on a regular enough basis? I think no matter what business you're in, whether it's the hotels or the restaurants for us, I think they're always trying to give the customer what they want. And so as customers express a desire for those kinds of things, of course, they try to find it. And that's why, in the restaurants, in hotels, or in some of the smaller restaurants, you'll see those specialty items that might be very local. The chefs like to use those kinds of local items. Some chefs even grow their own produce, on the roof of the building that they have. So, I think that there's a movement that way, of course, but it's all dependent on what the customer wants. You have to be able to stay in business as well.
I think that speaks really well, too, to the notion that we as a population need to have a little bit of understanding of these issues related to agriculture and be willing to get educated and informed and sort of think about the broad brush issues. I mean, if we were willing to eat seasonally and we knew what was in season, we might be asking our banquet sales manager for the kinds of items that we know are in season. And if we had that kind of working knowledge and we were asking for those kind of things, I think you're absolutely right. I think those businesses would be totally responsive. We've seen it happen in livestock and antibiotic usage. Over the last few years, consumers have been very, very vocal about their fears related to the use of the sort of therapeutic ongoing use of hormones and antibiotics in livestock production, and companies have been listening. The meat companies are changing, and I think Purdue is a great example in chicken. There have been quite a few really large-scale, commodity-scale meat producers that have gotten those antibiotics out, and that's really driven by consumer demand.
Yeah. And not to be too cold-hearted and callous about it, but again, as a business, if you're running a business, you want what's in season because it's generally going to be cheaper. It's going to be available, close by. Better. Yeah, exactly. You're not buying something that's been shipped halfway across the world to you. So I mean, it's a better value. It's got better taste. I mean, those are the kinds of things that obviously keep customers coming back. And if it's cheaper as well, then you're going to want to continue to do that.
That's the first kind of work I do with institutional chefs, and I know we'll get into this more in a minute, but just the notion that you shouldn't have the same menu all year round. Even if you only change it 4 times a year or even twice a year, if you just have a winter menu and a summer menu, ideally you might change it more frequently than that, but that paying attention to seasonality, because you're absolutely right. It's going to be more abundant, and therefore the price is going to be better, and it's going to taste better. It's a sort of an obvious win-win-win.
Well, and consumers want that too. I think people are excited about new dishes on the menu or something. I mean, what's the latest rise was the pumpkin spice, right? I mean, this last fall, everything was pumpkin spice. You don't see that in June. I mean, there's a reason for that. So I think, people associate foods and beverages with certain times of the year. Eggnog's another great example. So I think that people want to see that. They appreciate it. And generally, I think culturally, we're becoming a lot more food aware. And so people do know where their food's coming from, and they do care. And although it's been lampooned on shows like Portlandia, where you find out the name of your chicken, it may be not that extreme. But people do care about where their food's coming from and what they're putting in their bodies these days. And it's important to listen.
I think we're ready to move on to our third course. Getting back to something that Amanda was mentioning a second ago, we will be talking about institutional food. What do schools, hospitals, and prisons have in common? Terrible food. Amanda Oborne, you are an expert on this subject. Please get us up to date on the state of institutional eating. Is the food at schools and prisons getting any more nutritious? Is hospital food actually making people sicker? Because it seems like it is. At least when you go and visit that, relative who's in the hospital, you think, good God, how are they eating this and getting more healthy?
Yeah, it certainly depends on where you're visiting that person. Right now, there are a few very wonderful bright spots in the world of institutional food. But as you say, as a category, it's not necessarily the place you would take out-of-towners for lunch. So I come at this from the notion of how do we really develop strong, robust, resilient regional food systems. And I believe food service operators, so schools, hospitals, corporate cafes, assisted living facilities, all those types of food service institutions can actually be better partners to an ag-of-the-middle type producer. I think this is sort of a working hypothesis. I think they can be better partners than a typical grocery or, as you were describing earlier, Greg, a fast food restaurant that really has a stable menu and enormous volumes over time. Food service directors are a little bit like the restaurant chefs who have more flexibility, and they can make commitments to a farmer to say, I'll take your whole field of XYZ next year, and they can sign that contract. And that farmer, very importantly, can take that contract to their banker and say, I need a loan for that piece of equipment that will let me do this. Here I have a contract, a purchase agreement in hand from, XYZ corporate cafe or school or hospital. And that farmer then can make those steps into that ag-of-the-middle style growth that we were talking about a minute ago. But the other thing that schools and hospitals and jails have in common is that collectively they serve 48 million meals per year just in the state of Oregon. And Oregon's not really that big a state. We're about 4 million population. So you picture that in a larger state with a lot, denser urban centers, and you can see the impact that institutional food service can really make. So the work that we do at EcoTrust is trying to help food service directors who want to source locally overcome all those massive barriers. Greg mentioned a couple already, the price, the volume, the fact that they can't afford the labor costs, like Virginia was saying, of having staff standing around all day washing and slicing and dicing and prepping food. That food needs to come in, chopped and bagged and kind of ready to pour right into their dish. So we help them overcome some of those barriers. But there's a second reason for doing that. Purchasing power, those $1 million procurement budgets, is a big part of changing the food system at large. But those institutions are also the ones feeding some of our most vulnerable neighbors. When you think about kids eating school lunch or patients in hospitals, like you were saying, Catherine, people in jail,
assisted living facilities. These are people who are probably not shopping at some of our, boutique farmers markets or our fancy grocery stores. And so institutions become sort of a direct delivery vehicle for really nutrient-dense, great local food directly to people who could really use it.
Well, I did see something, Catherine, I think will make you happy or hopeful, I hope.
Tell me, Virginia.
At least for hospital food. It seems that last year when Medicare began paying based partly on patient satisfaction scores, hospital administrators began to focus on food, that this was something that they wanted. The Medicare surveys don't specifically ask about food, but hospitals believe that good food helped to boost their scores. And so this was something where it's, a couple of food management companies that specialize in healthcare facilities say they're getting more and more requests from hospitals that are looking to boost their satisfaction scores specifically by getting more local, like setting up gardens to grow their own vegetables, inviting local farmers to sell produce in their lobbies, or, doing, more interesting menus in the actual food services portion of the hospital. So I don't want to get cocky, or I don't want you to get your hopes up too much, but it seems like there's incentive and there's someone that's helping try to pave the way that maybe there could be some room for improvement in a lot of these places.
Your story, Virginia, completely reminds me of this very funny phenomenon that actually happens in assisted living facilities that the mom and dad that folks our age are shopping around and helping find a place for where mom and dad are going to go, probably mom, actually. One of the things the kids our age are looking at is the food. Now, mom probably wants, the canned corned beef or whatever that she may have gotten used to eating as a, sort of mainstream American consumer for many years. But when kids are assuaging their guilt about putting mom in an assisted living facility, they're really looking at food as one of those things. So it's become an enormous selling point for assisted living facilities. Not that, this is obviously more the case with private assisted living facilities, but But food has really become a competitive advantage in that industry, and I think in colleges and universities too, to some degree.
Is there such a thing as organic Jell-O? Is that going to be coming out anytime soon?
I think that's an oxymoron.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure that's possible.
Well, I know for some of those institutions that we talked about, prisons in particular, and some public universities, obviously, and maybe even hospitals who are nonprofit, again, part of what they're probably looking at is the bottom line. And in some cases, if it is a state-run, prison, they have to go with the lowest bidder, which is not always the most nutritious, or it does provide nutrition, obviously, but it's not maybe the best choice or the tastiest. Not having been in prison or a hospital lately myself, I couldn't speak to those dishes. Yes, exactly. So.
Well, the psychological effect of food that you were talking about, Virginia, and prisons, Greg, reminds me, have you all heard of the loaf? Do you know what the loaf is?
I haven't.
It's considered to be a cruel and unusual punishment in prisons, and if a prisoner is misbehaving, I don't know how prevalent this is in how many states in the United States, but if a prisoner is misbehaving, they feed the prisoner the loaf, which is, I think it's akin to dog food or something. It's basically nutrient dense but disgusting for however many days until, I guess, the behavior shapes up. But it's interesting that food can be used as torture in a way.
I think my mom used to make that once in a while when we were there too. I don't think she called it that. But.
Amanda, I was going to ask you, I have a friend who works with Kellogg's Food Away from Home program, and she was telling me that because of some changes implemented by the Obama administration, Kellogg's has done a lot to their institutional food program where they're just getting a lot more whole grains into things. There's a lot more education about nutrition that they're doing. And she was saying they've put a lot of work into this. And again, getting back to the current administration, everyone's kind of looking at each other and saying, this is great, but what's next? Are we going to continue to be having these financial incentives to provide this healthy whole grain food to our large customers, or is that going to go away? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know specifically. I'm not familiar with that program or specifically how it might be affected by the new administration, but I think the financial incentive that they're going to continue to face is their consumer dollar, just like we were talking about earlier, that this isn't a fad. It isn't going to go away because the administration changed. People in this country have come, the light has been turned on. You can't unsee now what we know about, large-scale sort of industrial big food, and the pressure to make that the clean label is the term of art now in the institutional food world, that they really want the enrichers and the antibiotics or the other additives, chemical additives, they really just want out of their food. And some of those additives have been linked to child behavior problems. And there's all kinds of research out there that I think is going to continue to help the eating public say, I don't want that anymore. And what are you doing? And show me and prove it to me that you're doing this differently.
Yeah, I probably should have not spoken so vaguely. I probably should have cited something. The Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010 upgraded nutritional standards for school meals by increasing the federal reimbursement rate for school lunches by 6 cents for districts that comply with federal nutrition standards. And that was the first real reimbursement rate increase in more than 30 years. So I'm hoping that the Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act remains in place.
I love you that you say that with such a bright, optimistic look. I really,
unpredictable.
Those programs are all on the chopping block. All of the supplemental nutrition type regulations and financial supports are really those are the things that are on the chopping block first, I think, right now. And there will be broad consumer engagement required to fight for those and to try and hold on if people care about that.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's so sad. I mean, my children, their elementary school has at least 20, 30 farm beds in the back. We take turns. I was the farm mom for my kids' class for 4 years in a row. And, they had a blast every fall, or we'd kind of till our beds and we would grow our crops in the spring. And the lunch lady loved harvest time. We would bring all the fresh, goods to her, and she would put them right in the salad bar for the elementary kids. They took so much pride in it. It just breaks my heart.
And I bet the kids actually tried things they wouldn't have tried otherwise because they had a hand in growing it.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's true. Amanda, I was going to ask you if you know much about this Northwest Food Buyers Alliance. I was just reading a little bit about that. And
yeah, I feel like somebody from EcoTrust paid you to ask that question. We actually convened that group. The Northwest Food Buyers Alliance is a peer-to-peer network of food service directors in Oregon and Washington and around the Northwest. And the whole point is to get them together to help overcome, swap best practices and tips and war stories and hacks for getting good local food into their institutional cafeterias. And so we meet with them a couple of times a year. We take them on farm field trips. We take them to each other's kitchens so that they can swap recipe ideas and techniques. And it's a really cool group. There are about 75 institutions, I think, now in the region that participate. And there's some great information on our website for folks that want to learn more about that.
Great.
I don't know if you all have heard Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History podcast.
Yes.
Did anyone hear the one about Bowdoin College? Amanda's nodding.
I read a little bit about it. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but
it's sort of tangential to what we're talking about. But he created a total uproar by claiming that elite colleges that spend more on quality food are robbing their student body of diversity because that money that could have gone into higher quality food could have been used to get more low-income students into the student body. And of course, Bowdoin sort of ripped that argument apart. But it was a big brouhaha last year.
I've only recently just fallen in love with the Revisionist History podcast because I think the issues are so fascinating. And I heard that episode just a couple of weeks ago and had this existential crisis for a moment of, oh my God, am I working on the wrong stuff? Am I enabling, richy rich, privileged kids to eat fantastic food at the expense of all of these, smart poor kids, as Malcolm Gladwell calls them in the podcast. It is interesting. He's an incredible storyteller, and he very much architects the story to make the point he wants to make. And I think that both Bowdoin and institutional food service in total got a little bit of short shrift in the way that story was architected. There's a happy middle ground. I think he focused a little bit on Bowdoin's very precious, over-the-top, something about I'm trying to remember what the food was.
Lobster. There was some lobster in there.
There was lobster, and there was some pancake. What was it? Like a kimchi something or other. On and on. It was a very precious. It was the kind of white tablecloth kind of menu item that, I'm surprised that my kids would never even touch something like that. So I'm surprised that college kids
isn't that
like
part of the point too, right? I mean, they're being exposed to different foods that they may not have been exposed to earlier in their life, or I don't know about you, but I've never eaten a kimchi pancake. So
the point of the story was, though, that it was so precious. It was so much money being spent on the food, as if this was, going to be comparable to a fancy restaurant. And couldn't all of that money and time and energy be focused and funneled instead into the scholarship program and into the recruiting of kids that don't have access? And I completely understand the point that he's making and actually agree with him in many, many ways. However, I think there's a happy middle ground where what he didn't talk about is that children and college students, and call them children, but young adults, have a hard time learning and focusing in class if they're hungry or if they're eating a bunch of garbage or if they're not accessing nutritious food. It's really hard to learn, and this is true at every level of education. And so having the college cafeteria source some good nutrient-dense, fresh, local kind of food, I think is absolutely laudable. It's taking it to this extreme where they're, fighting for the richy riches in their admissions process over the quality of the food in the cafeteria that I think was a little ridiculous.
But it is appealing, like you said, with the old folks' homes. You want the best for your family.
Exactly. It's the same dynamic.
Even if they don't want it, you want it, right?
You're going to like your kimchi pancake.
Kimchi is delicious, by the way, and really done when it's, local cabbage and
it's not that
fermented
expensive to make.
It's not. It's not that it's that expensive. He was really using it to illustrate a point.
Yeah. Well, this is so interesting. I feel like we could keep talking about it for days, but it's almost time to wrap up the show, so I think we better move on to dessert. Dessert is something we do on the show where we just share something we've been reading or enjoying this week that has something to do with food or beverage. And I'll go first because you mentioned school cafeterias, so I brought in this cute graphic novel that my kids have been reading. It's a series. I believe there are 10 of them. And the series is called Lunch Lady. And the Lunch Lady is the hero. I'm showing everyone the cover here. Nice. And she's got her yellow apron and her rubber gloves. And she's like punching the bad guy, the purple bad guy. He's got long fingernails and he's very scary. So it's super cute. This series is written by Jarrett. I'm going to totally butcher his name. Jarrett J. Krosowska, something like that. But the illustrations are super cute. The Lunch Lady is the heroine, of course, and her sidekick, Betty, are secret crime fighters who solve mysteries while cooking and serving lunch to an entire school. I think there was supposed to be a film starring Amy Poehler as the Lunch Lady.
That would be fabulous.
And I think it was tabled. I was looking it up because I thought, I don't think that ever came out. So I'm hoping that it's still on some director's desk somewhere, and it will still be made.
Make the Lunch Lady!
Oh, it's so cute. Anyway, that was my dessert. Greg, what do you have for dessert today?
Well, I'm a bit of a foodie, and I collect cookbooks. I probably have 500 or 600 of them. I also love marshmallows, and in particular Peeps. So I'm not paid for this advertisement, but I'm looking forward to the Peeps Oreos that are now coming out. But what I've been reading, I just picked this up the other day, and this is what got me kind of excited. Easter's coming, of course, is a cookbook called Marshmallow Madness by Shauna Sever. And it's all about the fact that, you can make marshmallows at home. That's actually the way they used to be made. And so rather than buy them in a plastic bag, you can get them yourself out of your own kitchen, and you can flavor them all kinds of ways. You can make root beer ones and margarita ones and maple bacon. And so it got me thinking that I'm going to make some marshmallows here before Easter comes up, and I'm excited about it.
And put margarita marshmallows in your kids' Easter baskets?
I don't know about they won't get them, but I might have them in my basket. I still get a basket too, so yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
That sounds really yummy. Thank you. Amanda, what do you have?
Well, I have to admit that my dessert is as wonky as everything else I talk about, but it's a bit of very good news in that a report just came out by Friends of the Earth featuring the Oakland Unified School District. So we talk a lot about how schools have such low budgets and they need such high volumes, and it's very, very difficult to make good food choices in a school district setting. And this report shares the results of research in a pilot experiment, basically, that was done in the Oakland district, where the school increased their fruit and vegetable and legume purchasing by 10%, decreased their meat and cheese purchasing by 30%, and focused instead of just commodity meat and cheese on, in some cases organic, in some cases grass-fed, but from the region meat. So less meat, better meat. In the end, they found that they reduced their carbon footprint by 14%, reduced their water usage by 6%. But most fascinating to me was that they dropped their budget by $42,000 for the year.
Wow.
Really?
Wow.
So I tell that story because it's possible. You can source good food. You can make really smart choices, even at an institutional scale, even in a school. It can be done.
Wow, that's really impressive. How about you, Virginia?
My dessert item is guilt-free chocolate is on the horizon, whether it is dime store candy or artisan truffles. So last week, I think, it was Mars, Nestle, and Hershey's were among 12 companies that committed to developing a framework to end deforestation in the cocoa supply chain, focusing specifically on the top two producing countries, Ivory Coast and Ghana. So that's fantastic news for all of the candy, Easter chocolate you see everywhere. And then meanwhile, there's a new wild label going on fine flavored chocolate bars, mostly harvested in Central and South America. And these bar makers are working with local communities to harvest wild-growing varieties that have fine flavor characteristics, and so they don't want them to go extinct. So they're working with communities to harvest that, make sure that it stays viable and grown, and then turning those into really high-caliber, high-end artisan chocolate bars. So you can get your chocolate fix without the shame.
I thought you were going to say without the calories,
that's right, that's
sugar,
You're still getting all that.
caffeine. But still, that's exciting. Yeah. I probably eat half a bar of chocolate every day, I have to say. I am addicted.
I have a little chocolate thing going too.
It's so good. Well, thanks, you guys. You were so much fun today. And those were some pretty hardcore topics, but it was really a pleasure chatting about them with you all. Thank you, Virginia Gewin, the science journalist who knows more than anyone I know about ancient everything, grains and heirloom, anything that's edible and heirloom. I feel like you know it all. Greg Astley, you know what I really want to ask you about some other time is what is the future of Airbnb? But
we could talk about that on another podcast for sure.
I'm so curious.
That would take up a whole one, I think.
Yeah, I have a feeling you have some interesting perspective on that. Amanda Oborne, Vice President of Food and Farms at EcoTrust and the daughter of a buffalo rancher.
It's true.
Thank you, everybody. Hey, folks, we want you to savor the conversation with us. Help other people find our show by please subscribing to and rating The Foretop on iTunes, NPR One, Stitcher, or however you get your podcasts. It only takes a few seconds and it helps us so much. At facebook.com/The Foretop, you can suggest topics for us to discuss. And tweet us, please, at @4top, all one word. Today's IACP award-winning, James Beard Award-nominated show was recorded in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon in the studios of OPB. You can read all about us on the OPB website. Our producer is Alex Ward. Special thanks to OPB sound supervisor Stephen Gray. And our theme music was performed by the incomparable wine importer Kermit Lynch. I hope you can join us for our next episode, and please tell your friends about the Foretop. Bye-bye.
Nuit blanche, nuit blanche, nuit blanche.
Do they leave tips in hospitals? I don't know.